My guest today is Krishna Karra, a reporter and data scientist at Bloomberg, which makes for a pretty interesting mix. So we talk about satellite images and data science and journalism telling stories, so processing data but also reporting on it for the public. In the recent months, Krishna and his team have showcased illegal oil transfer in the middle of ocean as well as mapping refugee camps in Rafah, all of which we dive into in this conversation. We go into satellite images, data science, journalism, and how you bring all these things together. This episode is brought to you by Beemaps, powered by Hivemapper. Your map is only as good as its data, and without fresh data, a map isn't smart, it's stale. Since 2023, they've mapped 350 million kilometers of roads, making it one of the fastest growing mapping projects in history. Here's the gist of how it works. Most gig drivers and commercial fleets already want dashcams for peace of mind, so Beemaps built their own dashcams that reward them for mapping as they drive. It's a purpose-built dashcam with consistent image quality, great positioning, and enough compute to extract key features of a map. If you've ever tried to use maps from smartphones and been disappointed, take a look at what they're doing. Beemaps offers simple APIs to access street-level imagery, or just the map features you care about, like speed limit signs. With Beemaps, you can easily see roads as they exist today without collecting your own data or compromising on quality. 3 of the top 10 map makers use Beemaps to keep their maps fresh. Try it yourself, and you'll get 50% off API credits through December 31st, 2024 with promo codes MINDS. Just visit beemaps.com/minds. That's beemaps.com/minds. So the way I like starting these conversations is I like asking the same question to everybody. I like asking people how they would describe themselves. So I'm pretty curious, how would you describe yourself?
I think I would describe myself as sort of like a poor man's data scientist, poor man's software engineer, poor man's cartographer. Like I don't think I'm the best at, you know, building tools or doing specific analyses or even making maps, but I think I cross enough of the boundaries between all of them that I can kind of sit in the middle.
Right.
So, yeah, I guess I'm a generalist, like a
Okay.
generalist satellite imagery practitioner
I
is,
like
I
that.
guess, how I would describe myself. Equal parts developer and equal parts analyst.
What's the
If that
difference?
makes sense. Analysts are responsible for the thing that you see. And so analysts, there's like, actually, I think most of the work in journalism, as far as satellite imagery goes, is like analysis or analysty kind of work. And so it's validation. It's like, that's the primary purpose. Like, is the thing that your image is saying or any model that you've built on top of it, is it accurate? And so like in journalism especially, we have to hand check almost everything. And so, it's like that's what it is. It's just looking through the data.
So you already have the data and you're trying to say, you made a story to make it really concrete. I like using examples. You were part of the team that wrote a story about illegal oil transfer in ships in these dark vessels. So these boats that meet up in the middle of the ocean, I think it was close to Malaysia, they turn off their transponder so you can't see them. They
Yep.
don't show
In
up
AIS, yeah.
in AIS, exactly. So they don't show up, but you can still see them in a satellite image. And so
Right.
you get the data. Are these the boats? It's like
Right.
looking at the information.
Looking at the actual, in this case, it was like looking through tiles of every single detection the
Yeah,
model produced to be like, oh, are these two ships next to each other?
right.
Is this a false positive?
Yeah.
Is it a single ship? And so like cataloging that entire thing, right? And so the model is really just an assist for the analyst, which was also me.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like an assist, right? And so and then I would say like analyst on the side of the model itself, it's like, oh, like is this cloud mask tuned properly such that like
Right.
it's masking out the clouds, but in this case it was like letting in small clouds where you could still see the ships underneath. Like I didn't want that data masked out, so have to look through all the data to make sure that that's actually happening.
That's more the developer part then, like where
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
building a model.
because you're in this specific case, you're looking for these boats, and so you could hire 50 people to go through that manually. But if you have
Exactly.
months, and especially if it's in the middle of the ocean, it's like a
And it's a
huge
and
area.
this was a huge area. It's definitely not global scale or
Yeah.
continental scale, but still a very large area spanning multiple of the like MGRS tiles, right? For like that,
Yeah.
like Sentinel-2 captures or Sentinel-1 captures, and so Sentinel-2's revisit rate's 5 days or something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so it's a lot of data really fast.
So tell me about what does it take to, because we're talking about models here. Like this is some pretty big heavy lift for the end result is a story. It's
Yeah.
an article that Bloomberg publishes, but I want to keep it broad. Like in journalism, the end product is a story.
Sometimes.
Okay.
I think that things are slowly changing. I think generally you're right. The end product is a story. It's a web page. People go there. There's a takeaway. There's some data. There's some charts. There's some numbers, right?
Yeah.
If it's a good data journalism story, there's like hard numbers. I think that what I'm excited about, anyways, is going one step beyond and actually producing data sets. And
Okay.
so the Rafa story was an example where we produced a data set and actually got approval to like share that and publish it. And so I think there is precedent for that in journalism. I know the Times has like published data sets and other places, I'm sure, but I would say it's not the norm. But I think that's where I think as like data journalism and this type of analysis gets more sophisticated, it's like newsrooms do produce data sets.
Yeah.
And it's like then they have to decide, do they want to publish it or not, which then is like how much validation did you do on the data? Are we confident to publish this? Can we like put error bars to what we did? And you start running into all the things that data scientists run into when they're publishing data at companies or academics. But it's a different process.
What's the value of publishing a data set? If I'm the New York Times or I'm Bloomberg or the Wall Street Journal, like any of these news organizations, the reason I ask this question is because New York Times, Bloomberg, like you have to pay. You pay to subscribe to read the article. That's how you make money and hire someone like you to do the next story.
Sure.
What's the value of the data set to publish it?
I think the primary value is probably like public good or humanitarian. That was and like if people are asking for it who have a real need for it. So in the Rafa example, the reason we published the data set for where the tents were because we got like a request from the World Food Program to share that data set because it would help them with their planning purposes.
I was going to say, can you explain that story just for people who might not be familiar?
Sure. Yeah. So this was a story that started, I think a lot of stories start with like there's interest from the like newsroom to do reporting on a particular topic. This story was something that was published like pre the invasion of Rafah from the IDF. And it was like widely known that it was a place where a ton of people had settled. And, in satellite images, you can see massive tent encampments kind of spread across the city. And we wanted to do a story where we were trying to show the scale of that. And we had access to SkySat imagery from Planet where they're pretty clearly visible. And so I was like, oh, I wonder if we could actually like build a model to find all of them because it's visually obvious by eye, but also they're so small and they're spread everywhere such that it is actually pretty hard to manually, I think that's the first question you should ask yourself before you ever build a model. It's like, can you just do this manually? And it was one of those situations where it would have been way too much work to do manually, even over Rafa, which is a pretty small geography. And so that's kind of how that story started. And then we built the model to identify where they were at a particular point in time. And we published a piece that was basically just kind of showing that on a map, overlaid also with where buildings were destroyed. And that was analysis that was done by Jamin and Corey, who I don't know if you know, but they, Jamin Vandenhoek, he's from Oregon State University, and Corey Shear is at the City University of New York. And they have this amazing academic collaboration where they're producing damaged building estimates from interferometry from Sentinel-1. And they kind of publish that data every month and give it away to media outlets. So yeah, that was a story, and you're right. The story was a visualization that was like to show the scale of, where all these people were in this particular place. But as a byproduct, we did produce a data set, and that was a situation where we were able to publish that and release it.
Do you have insights as to who asked those? So you say people were asking for the data set. Who's using those?
This was folks from the geospatial unit at the World Food Program.
Okay, yeah, that
Yeah.
makes sense. Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, I've had Jean-Martin Bauer. He was the country director in Haiti for a couple years. He's been at the World Food Program for a few years. I had him on the podcast, and he said like they need some of these to know. In Haiti, for example, after the earthquake, they were like, what do we need to send people? Do they need foods? Do they need shelter? Do they need medicine? Like I'm just tying that back to a previous conversation I've had. I see what you're talking about.
And the other benefit, and I don't know if this is a benefit to like, Bloomberg as a news organization, or it's not necessarily a benefit to other news organizations, but by publishing data sets, you then also, I think, foster an interesting relationship with academia. So like academics like Jamin and Corey, for example, I'm just going to keep using them because I know them and they do great work in this particular space. But, like they could take that data set that I publish and then like spend, academic time frames are long, right? They can take that data set and be like, okay, like, does this work with all the data that we have? Could we build a model that like takes much more time that generalizes across a larger region? Maybe we could run that every single month, right? Like, so, and they can take data that we produce and like build something more real out of it, right?
Yeah.
Or more useful generally. And so I think that's I don't know. I think there's interesting collaborations that can happen between journalists and academics, because like journalists, like we have access to lots of data that other people often don't or have to pay lots of money for. And we have on the ground information sometimes to validate whether things are correct. And so I think, we can help academic researchers in that way, and they can help us too by we'll consume the products of what they create.
Yeah, I think that's something I wanted to ask you. Like, it feels like there's this sort of new, and maybe it's not new maybe this has been around for a while, but if I think about what a journalist is, it's the person that goes on the ground with their camera and their microphone and they go ask people and they take pictures and they show what's going on in a specific place. But now you can do a lot of that from, we're in New York right now. You can do that story about what's going on in the middle of the ocean in Malaysia, somewhere halfway around the world. You have access to, like, someone else took those pictures in a way. And you can tell that story. Like the way you report has really changed.
Yeah, I agree with that. And also I think the Malaysia story, for example, most of the reporting for that story was done by people who were on the ground.
Yeah,
there.
You guys are also sent someone.
And so and all the validation and knowing where to look and like uncovering the entire operation and having, and like going out to sea and like getting video of two tankers right next to each other. I mean, I still think that's the majority of reporting. And I think that these remotely sensed methods are they can sort of run things at scale in a way that you can't do when you're on the ground, right? Because you're there at a particular place in time. But I view it very much as complementary.
Right.
Or as like, it's not going to be as good of a story if like people weren't on the ground who actually knew something about the place and knew about what was happening.
That's something I also think is so interesting from, you have a data science background, so do I. There's sort of this tendency sometimes, this desire, because we can, to be like, let me create a data set or a graph of the number of tents that, there are here in this region, to go back to that story. And you can see the graph and it goes up. There's something about then showing the image, you see it. And there's something about going there and talking to one person and hearing the story of how this one individual went there. And most likely people will remember the one story. If you say 10,000, 100,000, a million, like they're abstract numbers, like people don't connect with that.
Right.
But that's what, as a data scientist, as I think maybe the analyst part, that's what we can do. That's what a lot of these tools allow us. The satellite image, you can get the model, you get the number out. How do you think about those two parts? What is the goal when you're trying to put out that story? Is it to sympathize with the people, and so then the individual is going to matter more? Is it to show the number, but people might not remember it as much?
It's a great question. I've been thinking about this a lot recently because of a question I got a couple months ago about sort of like, kind of like what you're saying, but it's sort of like, does data journalism sort of like, to put it very bluntly, does data journalism sort of dehumanize some of the like real stories and like the things that are happening, because like we're carried away with sort of like the eye candy of it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
And I think that just like, and this is actually the job of data visualization teams. Like this is, I think, the main contribution of those teams to stories. It's like, it's not doing the analysis, though it's a, important bit. It's really finding a way to tell the story that makes people feel something, right? And so like, our goal with the Rafa piece, and I worked with amazing colleagues who are like really good front end developers and cartographers who like know how to make maps and build interactive stories such that like you do feel something when you're. So it's not just a graph, right? So it's not just here's the data. The data is cool. It's like, no, like here's the actual scale, and it's maybe horrifying, maybe it's shocking, maybe it just puts you into that place, especially when there's no people on the ground, or maybe there's not a lot of people on the ground who can take you to that place. It's sort of then that's the job of the data visualization team, and that's something I have a lot of respect for, and I'm still learning a lot about from like other people on my team, because like you said, I do come from that data science world where it's like, here's the graph, here's the numbers, here's the data, done. We're done. But it's like, you have done like step one, and there's like 9 other steps to do to then make it something that evokes something.
I thought you guys did such a good job with the Rafa story, where, if I recall correctly, when you open the article, at first you see just the satellite image. You're like, okay, I sort of know what this is. Like, people inherently, are used to satellite images on Google Maps. And so you scroll, and then it overlays over time. Like, here's the analysis, like the bounding boxes of all the tents. And then you realize, oh, this is what I'm looking at. I thought that was so clever, because you could have just shown just a graph or just the result of the bounding boxes on the image. But there's something about, here's just the image at first.
And the scrolling of it.
Yeah,
too,
exactly.
Over such a high resolution. Image. That's
also,
I really give all the credit to that to my colleagues who really thought through all of that and how to really make that come to life.
Yeah, it's interesting because now it touches also on like the medium of reporting has also changed. So the tools, but also if it were print, you can't really do something like that. And so it's because I'm on my phone and I actually scroll and I have to do that. The other thing that I find hard sometimes, or I'm curious to know your perspective, is if you take an optical image like Sentinel-2, like the case in the story in Rafa.
That was SkySat.
Okay, so
planet.
3 meter?
50 centimeter.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So people can sort of visually see it by themselves.
Yeah.
You were talking about these academics that were providing building destruction,
damaged
building, but that's from INSAR.
Yeah.
So it's not only is it radar images, which in itself is hard to interpret, but it's a derived product from a radar image. So you can't just show that and say, here, look.
Right.
The thing is gray here
this
and dark there.
Unwrapping phase.
Exactly. Yeah. But the information that comes out is really, really useful.
Yeah.
And how do you put all these pieces together? How do you say, we have this cool data set, but I can't just show it to you?
In this case, the academics had done a lot of the work for us, which is they had taken the data from the raw interferometry, right? And like actually associated that with a building's data set, and we're really consuming that building's data set, and that's much easier to show um, on an optical satellite image. Also, very cool is that because we have this high res optical satellite imagery, we can validate sort of like as they give us the data. And so they, they're looking at INSAR, they're looking at building footprints, they're doing a fairly complex merge of the two to like provide their estimates. And then we can actually like take their bounding boxes and pull up the latest SkySat image and be like, yeah, no, it is destroyed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, so we can like do the validation right there.
Is there do you guys think about trust and how do you convey that to people who read? And there's a few things that I want to go into why I'm asking that question. The Malaysian dark vessel article that you wrote, here's the results, and then at the end there's the methodology. Like, here's how we did it.
Yeah.
So like you're showing as well, like we're not just pulling this out of nowhere, here's how we did it. That's one part of the questions, like why are you saying that? And the other part is media is in this sort of moment, is in this balance of like trust has gone down in these sort of legacy traditional media. The trust is really going down.
Sure.
How do you put those two things together and saying like, trust us, this comes from these satellite images that we're probably not going to show you because you're not going to understand it.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up the methodology sections. That's something that I always pay a lot of attention to, especially for something that requires a lot of analysis. I think it's a hard balance to strike. Like, we wrote a fairly detailed methodology section for the Rafa piece. There was like a flood model comparison analysis piece that had a very detailed methodology, and then the shipping piece that you just talked about. It's sort of like, who are you writing that for? I think there's, I think you're writing that for the reader so that they know how you did it. But then you're also writing it for like, at least I think this way, you're writing that for almost like a practitioner's audience who can then read what you wrote and like believe that you did the thing you actually said.
It's like
that
showing
you did.
the work.
Yeah, showing the work. Often for complex analysis pieces, we will run our methodology by academics, which is what we did in the case of the flood model comparison piece. Our entire piece was based on work from academics. So we actually ran our entire analysis and like shared code with academics so they could say, hey, like, we're off by a couple %, but we approach this slightly differently. Do you think our methodology is sound? And like, they gave us a green light. And then and then often for like pieces where we're making claims that might be disputed, the legal team will get involved and actually do like very like. So there's a lot of things happening from just our internal side to be like, yes, we're ready to publish this. And yeah, I mean, as far as your broader question about trust in the media, like, I'm not sure I have a great answer to any of that. What I do think is that like data journalism and like, remote sensing and satellite imagery, there's a certain level of objectivity to sort of what the data is saying. And so I think in some ways it's less disputable, because it's data. It's like, here's an image and look at what's in this image. Except, doing that at scale can be.
Yeah. No, I see what you mean. I think you guys highlighted that in the methodology for the dark vessel story, that this is based on sentinel imagery. So it's images every 6 days, give or take, which means there's 5 days where we don't actually know what's going on. And so I think about this as well in terms of,
and include clouds on top of that. It's like, how many observations are you really getting?
And so you're basically like, this is something that beyond just journalism is also, there's a bias in what you see. And so you can report, you can say, let's count all the, insert whatever thing you're counting, the boats or the tents that we see, and we can see that number go up. But like you're looking through the keyhole. You
Absolutely.
just have a tiny part. So there's like a lot of omission.
Yeah,
And that's really hard to convey.
it is.
I can only show you as much as I saw.
Yeah. And I think that, yeah, that's a great point that you bring up. It's a limitation of the data that I hope we convey in like
Yeah,
when
yeah,
we write the methodology. And also, but also in this case, it was, I think, more data than we had ever had from any
yeah,
other
yeah, yeah.
source. And so I think that's why it was useful. Yeah. Journalism is what makes me like have faith in the fact that like satellite imagery is actually useful.
Okay.
Because I feel like before getting into this job, I was starting to get into a position where I was like, I don't know if satellite imagery is actually useful for all the things that people claim it is. But when we use the nice thing about journalism is that when you use satellite imagery, it's because that was actually the most useful data set because we didn't have any other data that was, higher
Right.
fidelity or more accurate. And so it makes me happy. The utility of it makes me very happy.
Right. I want to expand on that. What made you have that point of view that it might not work out before journalism?
I think I'd worked at a fair number of like places, either as like a freelancer or full time, where you're like a geospatial company that's trying to do something like I'm just going to throw out some applications like land cover mapping or like crop type mapping or crop yield forecasting um, or you kind of name it. And it's like, there's companies that are trying to do it with satellite imagery. And I think a lot of companies struggle a lot of times to be like, well, was this map accurate enough? Was it timely enough? Did it actually provide the fidelity and information a customer actually needed?
Yeah.
And this is and I'm not trying to knock on any of these companies at all, but it's just a tough problem.
It's a hard problem. Yeah.
And I think as a data scientist, you can, make all the graphs you want about this, about something that your model said, but like, does anybody care about the result? And in journalism, setting aside whether does anybody care, it's like, well, at least it was useful for a story. And so that makes me happy.
What kind of data would you like to have? So there's so these questions of, if I'm an analytics company and I want to, a land cover, I might not need higher resolution in a spatial resolution, and I might want more frequent so in time.
Sure.
So depending on like what you're looking for, everybody has their wish list of like, I wish we had more data.
Of course.
Do you have such a wish list, or are you like, we're good? And
we're
what
not
is on
good.
it? What's it's Christmas season. Come on, give me Dear Santa.
Well, since you mentioned land cover maps, so land cover maps, I was just kind of knocking on them a little earlier, but they are the starting point for everything.
Yeah.
Like land cover is kind of everything in the most general sense. And it's one of the best things that satellite imagery is good for. And so high res land cover maps would be unbelievable. We don't really have maps better than 10 meter that aren't over like a tiny area, as far as I know. So if people built better land cover maps, I would be the first to use them. I think they're just amazing. And so, yeah, land cover, absolutely. Like, I think one of the first stories I worked on when I started was like looking at the impacts on agriculture from the war in Ukraine. And so I was looking for crop type maps. And high resolution crop type maps are really hard to find in a lot of countries in the world. And so all these things are like, all these things are useful. It's just we always have to make the decision of when we like look at a data set to be like, oh, is this good enough? And often the answer is no. Because of the granularity or the fidelity or the timeliness of it. And so, which is why we do more of it ourselves sometimes. But yeah, what else would I love to see? I mean, I feel very fortunate to have access to the high resolution data that I do from Planet, for example. I'd love to see high resolution data from other like Umbra and other data
Radar
providers,
imagery.
Maxar. Yeah, I mean, we we can ask for stuff and sometimes get it, but there's so much data that we're still not seeing that I think we could be seeing, that are super useful.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Tell me about how the journey of a story. You said it starts with there's some interest in the newsroom. What's that process like?
Yeah. And so um yeah, there's there's sort of like big news items that are flagged from editors that are like, this is this is what's happening in the world today. And like, here are things where we could possibly contribute from like a graphic standpoint or an analysis standpoint, right? And like that's just like a daily thing that's happening that editors are keeping track of and are responsible for. And they're sort of talking to the larger newsroom and are aware of where people are reporting and not. And so if it's breaking news or like faster turnaround stuff, let's say like there was a fire that happened and like there's a great Sentinel-2 capture of it. Like that might be a graphic that just goes in a story that takes half a day to make. Maybe you're doing a quick like burn scar analysis or something like that, hotspot visualization, and like that just gets embedded into a story from a set of reporters who are actually reporting on it, and like that's fast, right? It's like not too much coordination. There's like an editor who's gonna like check your graphic and make sure it's it's like conforming to all the guidelines that
Mhm.
Bloomberg has and style guide stuff and all of that, and then it just goes into the story and it's out there. Boom, you're done. That's short term stuff. Medium term stuff. There's probably like people are pitching. So people on the graphics visualization data teams, they're like, oh, I'm really interested in looking at this. And they're sort of like making a case to the editors that we should do this. If there's interest, uh, uh, usually some of the most successful collaborations are like finding actual newsroom people who are also interested in it. So if there's a climate angle, Bloomberg Green has a big climate reporting team who are interested in all kinds of things. Uh, and so if you can get a couple reporters on board, like fantastic, then you can like meet together. There will be an editor on the reporting side. There'll be an editor on the graphics side. There'll be graphics people, data people, newsroom people. We're all part of the newsroom, but I think you know what I mean.
Yeah, so it comes from like a lot of different.
Yeah, and we'll kind of like and a story might come together and it might take weeks and maybe a couple months, and that'll be a longer story, right? With like more interactivity. Maybe the graphics are more complex.
Yeah, because you were talking earlier about running model predictions. So what's the story behind that? Do you just have a sort of generic bounding box model or like object detection model? Do you have like a tool shed of all
Yeah.
these tools that you guys can have, and you fine tune it on just this specific area? Because we were talking quickly about this before we started recording. Like you're not a company that's building a product. You're not building like selling an analysis, and so you're building this one pipeline
It's
of
a one-off.
Yeah, it's always like these one-offs, but there's probably tools that you want to reuse. You can't just reinvent everything every time. Like what does that process look like?
Good
How
question.
do you guys
Good question. Before I talk about the stuff specific to this, it's important to know there's engineering teams that are supporting the newsroom.
Okay.
And so there's a ton of internal tools that like govern our build system for how pages get put up, right? And like how certain types of quick maps and quick graphics for breaking news, like you don't have to make that from scratch. You can use internal tools to like get 90%, 95% of the way there, sometimes 100% of the way there. So engineering teams are like heavily integrated and are supporting the newsroom, but for anything that's not simple or kind of like a standard graphic, we have to do it ourselves. And we don't have, we're not as sophisticated as you might think. We don't have off the shelf object detectors that we're pulling off the shelf. We don't necessarily have a robust internal set of tools. I mean, this is something that I would love to build up in the newsroom over time. I haven't been there super long. But no, we're sort of starting from scratch. And so as a remote sensing person, I'm relying on the tools available to me. And so I often reach for Google Earth Engine.
Okay.
Me and others on my team are like deep in QGIS. We're using
Right.
MapShaper. We're, Python, GDAL. These are like our bread and butter tools that we, some people are really comfortable in R. And so there's everybody's a developer in some way or form on my team. And so we're just doing what we can with the tools that we have. We can occasionally spin up, cloud resources, but most of the time we're just running stuff on our computer, or I'm using platforms that I have available to me.
I wanted to ask also about, how do you guys keep up with sort of everything that's going on? You're in both in terms of the imagery, but also the tools. So we've had a big revolution in convolutional neural networks like 10 years ago. Transformers are everything that everybody's talking about at the moment. There's all these big changes that are happening, and they happen pretty quickly. And I'm guessing the most interesting stories are sort of at the edge of what is this new thing that we can do that other people might not be able to do. How do you, is there R&D efforts? How does a newsroom, how does the whole team decide on, I'm just going to go tinker on this thing because I think it's interesting and I don't know if there's something on the other end?
Yeah, I think this is a big challenge. And since I am fairly new to the newsroom, I have mostly been in the world of like having time to tinker and try out some of these newer models, like, segment anything, these like vision-based segmentation tools, or different platforms for data access and all that kind of stuff. And now our timelines are generally much tighter. So I find myself reaching for the tool that I know. And I think most people in the newsroom are like that. They reach for tools that they know work and they know how to use, even if there was some other tool that was more optimal in some way, or because we have to get work done, and mostly our timetables are not that long. And so, I think we can have some time to tinker depending on like how much time we have for a project. Some projects really do take months and months and months, so you have more time to try things. But it's a different kind of pressure than I think when you're a data scientist and your job is to kind of try these different tools. Our job is not to try those different tools. Our job is to like produce the output. And so I think it's a challenge. I feel lucky that I came from the world so that I kind of know what to pay attention to a little bit. But I feel like I'm already behind in a lot of ways. So yeah, just carving out more time, I guess. Or
is the pressure to what is the main pressure, the main incentive? Is it to try to get the story out as quickly as possible, while getting things right? Like you said, the timelines are shortening. What's going on there?
I think I think a lot of stories are not months and months long. And so there's just, there's just like news is, if you news has to be timely almost by definition.
Right.
And so, unless you're doing a big retrospective analysis, then there has to be a news reason that you're doing that. Like you're saying something that somebody hasn't already said 6 months ago about what happened. So then those can be larger projects, but a lot of times it's like the thing that's happening now is the thing that you want to say something about. And if imagery or a model is going to help with that, like it kind of has to help pretty fast, or else, news will move on and nobody will be interested. And so our pressure is really just because of the nature of news in some sense.
The way I think about this is if you come out with a story about the Olympics right now, nobody cares.
Yeah.
But if you did it during the Summer Olympics or the Winter Olympics, like there's a lot of interest in just what people are curious about, even if it's a retrospective of like, here's what happened over 100 years of Olympic Games.
Yeah. It's like in people's minds.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
What do you think you've learned as a data scientist working as a journalist in a newsroom rather than in a company that's building an analysis?
Yeah, I think that I have a I think in some ways the jobs are more similar than I thought they would be. Maybe that's just my particular role, but and I think a lot of journalists are very data savvy and data scientist and like very much data science practitioners. So I think there's more and more overlap between the two. But yeah, I really think so much of the difference is about how teams are structured,
Okay.
the the ways the goals of what you're trying to produce, and so I think those two things are different enough that I think the day to day can look very very
Right.
different. Even though some of the mechanics of the job are the
Right.
same
Right.
for me. Yeah.
Are there stories that you think were really good, either ones that you've done or you've seen other news outlets, news agencies, journalists, or anywhere else that you were particularly that caught your attention? And I'm asking because I think like at the heart again, it's a story. It's not just the data. It's sort of how you share that to everybody. So
Yeah,
it's there's a bit more than just I'm gonna make a cool analysis.
for sure, for sure. I think the Times did a big piece last year called like "What Ukraine Has Lost," and nationwide. It was a nationwide assessment of uh, damaged buildings from the start of the conflict, and it was, I think both, really impressive analysis that academic collaborators had helped a lot with, a monumental validation task by the newsroom, and then a visual presentation with a lot of like human stories in there
Hmm.
that really captured the scale of what was happening and made you feel something. So I was really impressed by that story. I just saw a story this morning that Reuters did about finding like graves in Sudan and using Umbra radar imagery, and I just thought that was like a really excellent use case of some of that data to like do something that like was massively underreported,
Hmm.
and like basically people didn't know, and so
And that requires expertise.
it
Like you
requires
have to know that
expertise.
you can do that, that you can see. Uh, I don't know what you're seeing. Probably the grounds changed or something like that. Like you have to know that
Yeah,
you can do that to even think about doing a
right.
story like that.
Yeah, there's just, I mean, I think those two stories are like coming to mind, but there's just been, you know, amazing reporting
Yeah.
from multiple outlets, on the data side that I'm really impressed with.
Are
Yeah.
you also you personally or know people at Bloomberg like exploring other mediums? So we were talking about how, as you move from having a print medium to something like a phone or your laptop, like it becomes like a website in a way. Like you can have front end, you can add animations. There's video is a huge place where people get their news, podcasts, like so just audio only we can't show. This is actually one of the things about this podcast. We talk about maps. Most people just listen,
Hmm.
which is a bit,
Hmm.
there's a conflict there.
Yeah.
Do you guys think about that? Because then report in different ways.
Yeah. Yeah. That's not something I think as much about. But Bloomberg does have podcasts
Hmm.
that like do talk about some of these stories. I think there was one for the shipping piece. Um, Bloomberg has a lot of like original video content. That's not something I personally think about as much. There is print as well with like the Business Week publication, but it's like, yeah, that's just something I have
Yeah,
not
yeah, yeah,
thought
it's
about
right.
at all. Like what other mediums could we do? I'm just kind of just so focused on doing
That's
some
fair.
analysis or
Yeah,
making a
yeah, yeah.
map or something like that. Yeah.
Same question as for the data. What kind of tools do you think would be helpful for you? You said you have to go pretty fast. You don't have necessarily as much time for R&D, like using QGIS, GDAL, Python.
Yeah.
What is on the wish list as well of I
Yeah.
wish I could make a model faster? Like what
Yeah.
are
Yeah. I think big on the wish list is like sort of like interoperability of all the like heterogeneous data that exists in the world, the geospatial data that exists specifically. Like, let's say you're doing a weather thing and you're like, we're always just like going to random websites from NOAA, like
Yeah.
somewhere deep buried in NOAA or some university site or like the European Commission on something that's made this land cover map. And like, it's a GeoTIFF over here and it's like a net CDF file over here.
Yep.
Here's a GeoParquet file. And like, there's like a certain sense for me in the newsroom of like, it's like I don't care. Like, just
Yeah.
give me the data in a way that I can ingest and use like right away. And some of these different formats, like, GDAL and OGR and these tools are like great for conversion and things like that. But it adds a lot of time, like getting all the data in one place. And so, tools like Earth Engine are great because like for the data that's there, it's like I'm accessing all of that through a unified interface.
Yeah.
And so that's a huge benefit because then it's like I'm writing some set of code to either like the same set of code in the same way to like then access and transform and manipulate that data. But if it's a file over here and it's a file over there, that's like, it makes it hard.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's almost like I almost don't care about the like technical benefits of GeoParquet versus GeoJSON. Like, I understand that those exist and that they're important, but like, we live in GeoJSON land and like, that's the format I would like because it works with all the other things that I have. And like, maybe there's a larger structural conversation that should happen at some point when like we adopt all the newest and greatest things. But like, some of those things are impediments to getting the job done as quickly as I'd like.
Yeah, and I think maybe back to what you were saying earlier, like the story is a one-time project. So you might need to say, like, it would be cool if you could say, hey, we're going to look at like all the dark vessels like across the entire world, across like the last 10 years. Like, it would be a cool story.
Yeah.
But there's also a lot of very narrow, like in space and time projects, and so you probably don't need like the most optimized format for this thing. Like,
and I worked on global scale stuff in the past, like in land cover mapping, and global scale anything is really hard. Even doing something over a year is hard because of seasonal changes in imagery. So like your favorite like foundation model that like finds something at this one particular point in time, like, does that generalize to a year's worth of imagery? It's probably going to start running into similar issues that you would run into if you're building it from scratch and having to deal with it. Similarly, like disparate geographies, like places look super different. They have like different spectral responses and like, models, like, it's hard for models to generalize. It's like a truly hard problem. And so it makes the field cool, but I think also makes it difficult to do global scale stuff. Also difficult from a data processing challenge, right? Like, platforms will fall over when you're trying to do stuff at global scale. And so, it's like both hard to do stories just generally from a global scale because like, what's the angle? But then also it's just hard to do generally, I think, even with a lot of the tools that we have. And so, I think and also, me as a reporter, like, I don't care if something takes like 30 seconds or 5 minutes. I just want it to work all the time. And so there's a little bit of like the coolest, latest and greatest thing. It's like, what is it really buying me? Is it really buying me like a better analysis or like, and so, I have my own biases on all that. And so I, reach for tools that I know. I will say that something I see missing in a lot of platforms and tools and things like that is that like getting your own data in and getting your analysis out of the system are things that I think that when I was just like a data scientist, I didn't think about as much, but it's something that is absolutely necessary for journalism. We are often using data that is either proprietary or we just have access to. So it's not something that is available to the world. So we have to, if I want to use some private data, some vector or raster data that's private, and I got to be able to get that into a platform
Yeah.
easily so that I can use it. Which Earth Engine I figured out how to do, but can be difficult
Yeah.
sometimes. And then, the other side is even more difficult, which is getting data out. And so
Yep.
I was running like a NDVI change and seasonally adjusted change analysis over Ukraine or something. And Ukraine is large, geographically massive country. And I was trying to export data, and like I had to like manually tile it up. This is an Earth Engine. Like I had to manually tile it up and like export tiles and then use GDAL to stitch the thing back together. And then I was like playing like, different resolution games based on the map that I wanted to make. But that was a lot of time to just get the data that I needed out of the system.
Yeah.
And I think Earth Engine is actually good at that compared to, at least they have a task system built in place to be able to like run tasks that are going to take multiple hours, maybe sometimes even longer. And so I think that's a piece that people don't think about. It's like journalists don't live in your tool.
Yeah.
We live in the ecosystem, and like we need to be able to get the answer out so that we can like make a graphic or a map or a chart. And so yeah, I think those are things that people don't think about as much.
Yeah. I feel like this is a nice place to round it up. I like asking the same question when I start. I like doing the same thing ending. I like asking for a book and a podcast recommendation. And there's a couple reasons for that. First, I think it's just a good way to hear about new things. Books and podcasts mostly still travel through word of mouth. And I think it's a nice way to learn a little bit more about like what are people interested in or have spent some time thinking about. So if you spend time reading, listening to podcasts, is there something you'd recommend? Doesn't have to be about anything we talked about, just something cool you came across.
Yeah. I recently read a book called Overstory, which I really loved, which I would say is like, I'm somebody who like enjoys the outdoors and being outside and being in forests, and living in New York City especially. I don't really go to forests anymore. But that book really made me appreciate life and trees, and made me think about like how all that looks overhead too, because I've looked at trees so much, in a way that was just like, woven through all these different characters of stories through time, activism. And so I thought that was just a really amazing book, which I think is very widely known. It won a Pulitzer Prize, but really love that book. So I would recommend that. For podcasts, that's a good question. I listen to a fair number of podcasts, and even though my job is like very, like I don't make a lot of political maps or work on elections or anything like that, but I listen to a lot of that type of reporting. So I like the Ezra Klein show. I think he's like a great interviewer that entertains multiple opinions and asks hard questions and listens and pushes back, and I appreciate that.
I'm gonna go on a tangent here, and I'm curious to have your opinion. So that's a New York Times podcast. Yeah. They just went. They took a big pivot where they went behind a paywall.
Yeah.
So the first, last 2 episodes, I think you can listen to them.
Right.
So if you go now, you're in your podcast app or wherever you go, check out Ezra Klein. You'll get access to 1 or 2 episodes. And the rest went behind a paywall. And I understand that from it takes a lot to make a podcast. I know a thing or two about that. And this is janky compared to them.
Sure.
But there's also, it's a big change from the history of the medium. Are you subscribed? Yes, no, why? What do you think about it as, a reporter as well?
Yeah. I am subscribed, and I do have some subscriptions to some media outlets and some magazines. And I think I subscribe not out of some larger philosophical belief in supporting your media organizations, which I do agree with, but I don't have some very strongly held belief about that. I think I subscribe just because I find it to be very good content.
Right. So it's you're buying a product.
Yeah, I'm buying a product, and I think it's good content. And there's great free content out there too, but I think, I think curation is a big deal. And that's really what you're paying for. You're paying for somebody to curate content for you, and for people to have money to check facts and
Yeah.
resources and things like that. And so, yeah, it's a price I'm willing to pay.
It's like if you went to the newspaper stand, you'd buy a newspaper. You're
Yeah.
doing the same for the podcast.
Yeah.
Cool. Krishna, thanks so much for coming over here and spending some time learning out about maps and journalism with me.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me on.
It was great.
Hey, thank you so much for listening to this conversation. I wanted to take a moment to thank the sponsor of this video, but also all the people who financially support me on Patreon. If everything goes well, these conversations should feel and sound seamless and effortless, but there's a lot of work that goes behind the scenes. I try to research and prepare these as much as I can to know who these people are and what makes them interesting and what would lead to a good conversation. I'm incredibly thankful to all the people who support my work on Patreon, meaning I can do a little bit more of it. This podcast started out as a way to learn more about the people in this industry, but I've also started making educational content on another YouTube channel that I'll put a link to in the show notes. And I want to make more content explaining how satellite images and maps work to a broader audience, as well as continuing to research the guests for these podcast episodes. So if you value the work that I do, I'd like to ask you to please consider supporting my work on Patreon. There's also some behind the scenes of how this podcast is done and some of the work that I'm doing for these educational videos if you want to learn more about how I do all of this. Either way, thank you so much for all of your attention and your time. I really appreciate it, and I hope you get value from these conversations. Thanks.